political gains outside of doing work related to education here in Chicago of our organization, Teachers for Social Justice, is really engaging in the sort of political education that helps us as a leadership corps and our members and the larger city of Chicago really come to terms with some of the issues, and in this case, the theme of our upcoming curriculum fair, Defund Policing, Fund Schools and Communities. And so by hosting this teach-in, we hope that participants that may be coming to the curriculum fair in the future are able to do some real intellectual work around what it means to defund police and what it also means to adequately fund the sort of schools Chicago students deserve.
And our students deserve counselors, not police officers. If the mayor is for real about trying to prevent violence, then you don't put more guns and more people using force on the streets where there's already violence. That makes no sense. What you do is you put counselors and you put mental health workers and you put social workers and you actually allow counselors. The few counselors we have in our schools can't counsel. They are doing casework. They are doing case management positions. They are subbing for teachers that are out. They are subbing because there aren't enough teachers, because they have created this space where no one wants to do this impossible job of teaching. And how does that affect our children? Our children are not well because of that.
The police, on average here in Chicago, we're spending $4 million a day to fund a system that is not leading to safety, that is criminalizing black and brown folks in the city of Chicago and incarcerating more people and more people into this large prison industrial complex that we have in the nation today. And so when we talk about defunding police, we're talking about defunding an oppressive institute and really allocating resources, in this case funding, towards the institutes that we know lead to safety, towards education, towards mental health services, towards employment opportunities that we know contribute towards well-being and ultimately the safety of our communities. Now, how we have that conversation, how do we lead to a world without police? I actually have to defer to the communities most impacted by police violence and state violence, black and brown, poor communities, and also trans and queer communities of color are impacted by these things exponentially more than those of privileged situations and those of white communities. So what we really need to do is give those particularly impacted communities spaces to engage in dialogue, to develop solutions, and to work together towards ultimately bringing safety and wellness to their communities.
And we know that this is mostly a black and brown district, period. It would not be happening. The things that are going on in Chicago public schools would not be happening if it did not serve primarily black and brown children, period. And so within CTU, there is a small core that is trying to basically take the power of 25,000 members and steer it in a direction of black liberation. You might go and ask CTU members and say, well, black liberation isn't what CTU is fighting for. We are fighting for a transformative education. That is a black liberation struggle. And so we're asking for the support. We're asking for our communities to be behind us, because that is our main goal, is how are the children. Our children are not well, and we have the things that we need in order to make them well educationally. And we know that once you have a strong quality education system, that everything else grows from that space. A lot of times if we look at the black agenda that a lot of youth organizations are putting out, they know that education and having a core, strong foundation, quality education is the root to everything else. But the police in our schools, again, that is a reactive measure, just like police in our communities. One of the things that I always talk about is one of the things that isn't talked about is the violence that has been done to these children before the violence that we see on the news. Nobody talks about this violence of destroying public housing. Nobody talks about the violence of closing schools. All of that is violence and disinvesting in these communities. That was the violence that was perpetrated towards those communities first, and now we're seeing the result of that disinvestment. We're seeing the result of that violence. So the only way that we can pull that back is we have to do the opposite. We have to invest in these communities.
There's 1.6 million children in the United States attend schools where there are police officers and where there are no counselors. There are more police officers in Chicago public schools than there are librarians and social workers and counselors combined. What happens when we move towards that alternative situation? What happens when we equip community spaces, and more particularly in our case, as it relates to the work of Teachers for Social Justice, what happens when we equip school spaces with all of the adequate resources that they need to be full of life, love, companionship, community, and that adequately give them mental health services? Do we actually need the systems of policing that we see in schools now that quote unquote lead to safe school spaces, which is not true either.
We know that employment opportunities helps to lessen crime. We know that having strong schools, after school programs helps to lessen crime. So we know the things that are necessary. We know that when we have counselors, they teach children how to deal with trauma. Our students are in a constant state of PTSD. They are in a hyper-surveyed state. So there is high anxiety, it's high levels of literally post-traumatic stress within their communities. And so putting more people with guns, putting more people that are going to use force and violence on the streets with that anxiety and with that high level of stress is not going to help the issue and the problem. We are going to spend millions of more dollars on police brutality legal cases. And that is what we're going to have. And we could be using that money for librarians because we have more police in our schools than counselors and social workers combined.
Wow.
So again, what is that saying about how the city views our kids? Do they view them as people who need to be policed and controlled, not educated?
So if we're going to have a movement for social justice, that has got to be a movement against state violence. And the largest exhibitor of state violence is the police force of the United States of America, or the Fraternal Order of Police, largest union in the United States. And we've really got to understand what not the individual actors called police are, which may be our brothers, our sisters, our nieces, our nephews, but really the system of policing that has done nothing but oppress from its conceptual stages as slave patrols to the current day militarized, hyper-militarized police force we see patrolling, surveilling, and locking up black and brown and queer and trans folks of color here in Chicago and across the nation. And we've got to really explore, one, the underlying causes of those things, and if we do, we can connect them to a larger movement for social justice, not as it relates to just policing, but as it relates to our well-being and the humanization of people in this country in general. Our upcoming Teachers for Social Justice curriculum fair is titled Defund Policing, Fund Schools and Communities. That'll be taking place November 19th.